Proverbs of Ashes. It's written jointly by Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Ann Parker. Some of you will recognize Rebecca Parker's name. She was president of Star King, our UU seminary in Berkeley, Star King School for the Ministry, for 25 years, from 1990 until her retirement in 2005. And this excerpt that I'm going to read, well, let me further explain. She grew up in a Methodist family. Her father was a Methodist minister. She went to a Methodist college, and she became a Methodist minister. And in 1980, she was serving her first parish in a little Methodist church in Puget Sound. And this story, or this account that I'm going to read, is something that occurred to her fairly early in her ministry. Here's what she writes. One day, sitting in my office, my reading was interrupted by a quiet knock on the door. Marking quickly the prayer I had chosen for the Sunday service, I closed the book of worship and opened the door. A short, brown-faced woman stood on the threshold, bundled up against the chilly Seattle weather. Hello, Pastor. I'm Lucia. I live down the block and I walk by the church on the way to my bus every day. I saw your name on the church sign. You are a woman priest. Maybe because you are a woman, you can understand my problem and help me. Of course, I said, come in. She sat down on the old sofa next to my bookcase with its load of theology books bending the shelves. She smiled, an expression both warm and sad. I haven't talked to anyone about this for a while, she began, and her smile faded, and sadness deepened her eyes. But I'm worried for my kids now. The problem is my husband. He beats me sometimes. Mostly he is a good man, but sometimes he becomes very angry and he hits me. He knocks me down. One time he broke my arm and I had to go to the hospital, but I didn't tell them how my arm got broken. I nodded, says Rebecca. Lucia took a deep breath and went on. I went to my priest 20 years ago. I've been trying to follow his advice. The priest said I should rejoice in my suffering because they bring me closer to Jesus. Accept the beatings and bear them gladly as Jesus bore the cross. I've tried, but I'm not sure anymore. My husband is turning on the kids now. Tell me, is what the priest said true? Lucia's deep black eyes searched my hazel ones. I wanted to look away, but couldn't. I wanted to speak, but my mouth wouldn't work. It felt stuffed with cotton. I couldn't get the words to form. I was a liberal Christian. I didn't believe God demanded obedience or that Jesus' death on the cross brought about our salvation. I didn't believe those things at all. But just that past Sunday, I had preached a sermon on the willingness of love to suffer. I preached that Jesus' life revealed the nature of love and that love would save us. I had said that love bears all things, never breaks relationships, keeps ties of connection to others even when they hurt you, places the needs of others before concern for the self. In the stillness of that moment, I could see in Lucia's eyes that she knew the answer to her question just as I did. If I answered Lucia's question truthfully, I would have to rethink my own theology. More than that, I would have to face choices I was making in my own life. After a long pause, I found my voice. It isn't true, I said to her. God does not want you to accept being beaten by your husband. God wants you to have your life, not to give it up. God wants you to protect your life and your children's lives. Lucia's eyes danced. I knew I was right, she said, but it helps to hear you say it. We stayed in touch as she took the next steps in her life. Eventually, her husband sought help for himself. Lucia agreed to let him spend weekends with their children. They got their father back, she said, and I got my life back. We'll have just a few seconds of music to let this settle in for you. We talk a lot about love in our UU circles today, as Mindy made reference to in her welcome to you this morning. And as I was thinking about a sermon on Christian heritage, a few weeks ago, I came across an essay by a Christian minister telling of a conversation he had had with one of his congregants who was struggling with a loss of faith. Feeling like he was just through with the Christian church, the parishioner asked his minister, "Why do you still bother with Christianity?" It was a provocative question. And in fact, in my own case, I still do bother with Christianity. I read a lot of Christian history and theology. Most of the time, I don't think of myself as being a Christian. Like some of you, I grew up in the Christian tradition. For me, it was a Quaker church in early childhood. Then later on in my teen years, a Methodist church. But I was also a budding scientist. I was fascinated with astronomy and mathematics and physics. And I became impatient with all the time-worn theology that I was hearing from my Methodist church and its minister. I was full of questions, but questions didn't seem to matter much in that church of my childhood. And so when I went off to college, I turned away from Christianity. I turned away from the church. I dismissed it all and tossed out any interest in God or religion and stayed in that place through my 20s and into my 30s. But a funny thing happened on the way to midlife, as they say. I discovered the UU Church, and along with it, a new way of digging back into my own Christian past, a new way of looking at Christianity, of understanding it, and even of retrieving pieces of it and finding nourishment from those pieces. What I found was that there was a whole tradition of liberal Christianity that no one had ever told me about. Certainly not that Methodist minister or anyone in my teenage Methodist church. All I heard there was dismal and depressing and outdated and intellectually insulting versions of Christianity, which, as far as I knew at that time, was the only kind of Christianity there was. So my discovery of liberal Christian theologians was a liberation for me. It started me back on a journey backward in time, so to speak, a way of returning to some of those Christian stories and images and ideas and memories from my childhood, and to the possibility of understanding those in new and, for me, liberating ways. But enough about my own journey. What I want to say something about now is the journey that Christianity itself has taken, and the journey that our Unitarian and Universalist movement and our ancestors have taken both inside and then mostly away from Christianity. What do these journeys mean for us today as Unitarian Universalists? What insight does that Christian heritage have to speak to us today? One of the things that fascinates me is how the early Christian church got its start. You might think that that is a question that was settled long ago, but it's still very much an ongoing topic of research. There's a book just published about a year ago that I've recently read. Its title is After Jesus and Before Christianity. How big a gap do you think that might be? 20 years? 40 years? 200 years or 300 years. 300 years. What they're doing is trying to tease out what happened between the time that Jesus died and the time that the first Christian creeds were written down in the year 325, a period of almost 300 years. And notice the subtitle, a historical exploration of the first two centuries of Jesus movements, plural movements. Because there seems to have been a huge variety of Jesus movements, along with a large number of gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. We have full or partial texts of somewhere around 50 gospels from that era. Only 4 of them made it into the Bible, as you may know. It wasn't until the early 3rd century, as I say, that any single coordinated and widespread organization began to emerge that anyone could call Christianity. Before that, it was just a scattered mess, we might say. And theology was all over the place. The doctrine of the Trinity is what was formulated in the year 325, a tortuous notion of there ever was one. And a bunch of other creeds were written, and the barbaric notion arose that an angry and vengeful God had to be appeased by Jesus' torture and death in order to pay off the sins of humanity. How could such an idea arise? A monstrous God who demanded agonizing and tortured suffering as a condition for salvation. Who would even want to worship a God like that? Why would such a God even be worthy of attention, much less worship? God as a child abuser? That violates every precept of love that we ever see in the life and the teaching of Jesus himself. And yet people did affirm such beliefs. By the 11th century, that doctrine of atonement, as it came to be called, or sometimes called penal substitutionary atonement, became the dominant theology of the cross. And it's what I was still hearing 10 centuries later in that Methodist church of my teenage years. The message seemed to be, maybe Jesus loves me, but God is angry and just wants payback. My friend Tripp Fuller, who's a liberal process theologian, says We have lots of different ideas about God, but he thinks God should be at least as nice as Jesus. But that's what a lot of Christians came to believe in substitutionary atonement. And that's what our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors both rebelled against. The Unitarians were first, way back in the 1560s in Poland, where the first churches to challenge the Trinity were established. But I'm going to focus not on the Unitarians, but on the Universalists this morning, because they are the ones who specifically lifted up the idea that God is love, and that love is what Christianity is really and most fundamentally about. Universalist ideas began circulating in the Atlantic colonies in America by the 1740s. In 1744, the first openly Universalist congregation was founded in Gloucester, Massachusetts, under the ministry of John Murray, a settler from Britain, and a come-outer himself from Methodism. And about the same time, Universalist congregations further inland, up and down the Connecticut River Valley, were formed by dissident Methodists and Baptists who were abandoning their own church and listening to this new theology that was being preached about God being love and there being no such place as hell. It was Hosea Ballou in 1805, in his book, A Treatise on Atonement, who established the theology that would guide Universalists through the 19th and into the 20th century. A belief in a God of eternal benevolence and love. Ballou argued that Jesus was sent by God to demonstrate and exemplify the true meaning of divine love, not to be a sacrificial victim. And that was seen as a biblical doctrine, attested by many passages in the Christian Bible. I'm sure you know some of them, but just let me recall a few for you. In the Gospel of Mark and in parallels in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke also, you find Jesus being asked, what is the greatest commandment? And his response is that you shall love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is recorded as saying, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. In Paul's familiar letter to the people of the church in Corinth, you remember these words maybe. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and angels, but have no love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And a few sentences later, now trust, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. And finally, my final example, in the first letter of John, beloved, let us love one another because love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. So that's how things stood with the Universalists around in the 1830s, just about 200 years ago. And at that time, both the Unitarians and the Universalists saw themselves still grounded, with their belief still grounded in the Bible. But they were embarking on a journey away from rigid orthodoxy and proclaiming an enlightened and humanistic interpretation of Christianity. Both Unitarians and Universalists looked upon the life of Jesus as an example for human living, a model of ethical relationship and moral behavior. The parables and the sermons that are attributed to Jesus in the Bible were told and retold as moral lessons. The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the Sermon on the Mount, stories of how we should live with one another. They were the guiding images for religious living in the hearts of people. And we might even say, in an early way, they were imagining the church as the beloved community that we talk so much about today. And then something surprising happened, first among the Unitarians and then the Universalists. It was the encounter with Eastern religions. Scriptures of Buddhism and Hinduism were being translated into English for the first time in that era. Unitarians were reading them. Unitarians who believed that religion was all about ethical living, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what they found was in Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam and in Judaism were variations on that same thing. All these religions were basically saying, live your life like you would like other people to treat you. And so the question obviously arises, what's so unique about Christianity anymore? And that was a fateful question for them to ask. And it became a step away from Christianity. Unitarians at first aspired to an ethical religion that would be worldwide, that didn't depend on any particular religion like Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism, but shared the ethical insights of all these world religions. And you can recognize this in today's Unitarian Universalism. The 7 principles of the UUA bylaws, which we've come to be familiar with, and for some people are almost a creed, an object of worship, you might say that we've had a tendency to become more an ethical philosophy than a religion. Of course, we still speak of love as a spiritual force. Some of us equate love with God, as the Universalists did, the early Universalists. And others would like to dispense with the word God altogether. That's not completely true, of course, but there's been a strong move in that direction. And one of the things I want to ask is that a good thing? Are we a stronger collection of churches as Unitarian Universalists, a stronger and more fulfilling religious tradition and community as a result of having left every bit of Christianity behind us, even the good parts? Do we find ourselves more personally inspired by lists of principles and ethical ideals than our forebears were by those stories of Jesus and how he lived his life? I mentioned earlier that I do read a lot of Christian theology these days. And one of the reasons for that is that for me, our own UU religious language, our language of reverence, as we sometimes call it, for me has become thin, like watery soup. It doesn't feel very nourishing, not satisfying to me at least. There aren't many UU theologians these days who are writing good, solid, exciting, and groundbreaking theology. We talk about theology, we talk about love, we continually sing about it, but deep theological thinking about the meaning of divine love, what love is as a religious principle, I'm not finding a lot these days. Now, maybe I'm just weird. Maybe I'm just a theology nerd. But in all of our contemporary UU talk about love, side with love on our t-shirts, living on the side of love, I'm not finding it. In fact, what I'm finding from some interesting Christian theologians is books like Pluriform Love, The Uncontrolling Love of God, and several others like it that unpack the notion of love in contemporary terms and in terms that don't hearken back to that barbaric theology that so many of us associate with Christianity. Like the word God, love is hard to define. And yet it's a word, I think, that draws us in, that we respond to in some natural ways. Jesus never gave a definition of love either. He just showed what it looks like in the living of his life. For all their talk, Universalists never gave a definition of love either. Like Jesus, they just talked about a loving God and left it at that. So maybe we should too. As St. Paul wrote, love is patient and kind. It is not boastful or puffed up. It bears all things. Maybe it's love that is what we most deeply share with progressive Christians today. Liberal Christians today place their focus on love and justice, just as most of we Unitarian Universalists do. That's the main thing I suggest that remains of our Christian heritage as we have come out as Unitarian Universalists. And maybe even we have helped Christians in mainline churches like Methodists and Presbyterians and Lutherans to see that all the focus on Jesus' death and the cross is misguided, and that was never really what Christianity at its deepest heart ever was about. And so I say Jesus and the Universalists got it right. In the lives we lead, seek to lead, lives of goodness, of beauty, of compassion, and in the communities and the societies that we seek to build, beloved communities, communities of kindness, of cooperation, of diversity, of healing, of respect for difference, communities of moral beauty. And in the end, all of that vision and aspiration, I think it is indeed love that will guide us, that should guide us in all that we do. And I invite you, therefore, to sing about them, as we often do in one of our most familiar hymns, Love Will Guide Us, number
131.
131. Thank you.